On Face the Nation, people who will see higher premium increases.
We have a brand new study that just came out last week by Avalier, a respected consulting firm, that says it will more than offset the repeal of the individual mandate. And keep in mind that the individual mandate fines fall disproportionately on low and middle income families. 80% of those fines are paid by families who make less than $50,000 a year.
All right, Senator, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, John.
And we'll be back in 1 minute to hear from the #2 Democrat in the Senate, Richard Durbin. Us now is Senate Democratic Whip Richard Durbin. He is in Springfield, Illinois. Welcome, Senator. I want to pick up on something that Senator Collins said about the choice that senators may face if Roy Moore is elected in Alabama. And the question is, what business does the Senate have in overturning the will of the people of Alabama if he's elected? Senator Collins says that's a very tough decision. What's your sense of it?
Well, John, I can tell you this. First, the decision is to be made by the voters in Alabama on Tuesday, and I hope that they will do the right thing in terms of defining their standards and values when it comes to the people representing them in Washington. But we have heard from Republican senators first, who have suggested that if Roy Moore ends up being elected to the Senate, he would face close scrutiny, investigation, even removal from the Senate once he arrives. I agree with Senator Collins. It's a complicated issue, but I will tell you this. We faced the reality this past week. I've known Al Franken for over 20 years. He is my friend. He was on the floor of the Senate announcing his resignation. I sat just a few feet away from him. He said it was the worst day in his political life. It was a somber feeling. It was a reality. And I hope the voters of Alabama appreciate that reality when they make their decision on Tuesday.
Let me ask you about a political critique of the Democratic Party's pressure on Al Franken that led to his resignation. Dahlia Lithwick writes in Slate a piece that says, morality is no longer its own reward. What we get in exchange for being good and morally right is now nothing. The argument that the Democrats have a standard that leads Franken to go, and the Republicans the Republican committee supporting more, the president's supporting more, and that essentially Democrats are on the high road, but it's a politically bad road to be on.
I can just tell you your interview with Susan Collins demonstrates that's not true. There are Republicans who feel very strongly about this issue and have said so. And I think if more do, then we can establish a national standard, not a partisan standard, when it comes to the future of relationships with women. This, to me, from Susan Collins' comments, gives me hope that the Alabama voters will do the right thing, and we'll also see both parties coming to the same conclusion on this issue.
A final question on this, Senator. There's a criticism that that Al Franken was pressured not just because of the specific facts of the case, but Democrats wanted to look good in comparison to Republicans. What's your response?
I can tell you it was a painful process because of our personal friendships and relationships with Al and his family. There was no political calculation in here. It was just a painful moment when we made a decision, move forward on the Democratic side. I hope the Republicans will face that reality as well.
On taxes, Senator, what can Democrats do? This is moving into the conference committee, and Republicans have the votes to pass it. What are Democrats going to do?
Well, it did pass the Senate. There was only one Republican Senator, Bob Corker, who voted no. Susan Collins made it clear she's still waiting before she makes her final decision. I think others are in the same position. Jeff Flake, for example, from Arizona, made it clear that bringing up this issue about DACA and the Dreamers is critical to his vote when it comes to tax. So I can't assume where the Republicans will end, but they have an awful lot to accomplish in a very short period of time.
You mentioned DACA. Let's just go off on a side road there on that. A number of your Democratic supporters, colleagues, would like you as a Democrat to basically make funding of the government, to keep the government running, would like you to make it contingent on doing something about DACA. Will you?
Well, I can tell you this, we don't want to see the government shut down. We want to move forward in a bipartisan fashion to solve our problems. We believe that DACA is central. The president is the one who made this the issue. September the 5th, he eliminated the DACA program and put in doubt the future of over 780,000 people in America. And we want to get this done and accomplished. 34 Republicans in the House came out last week and said, do it before the end of the year. Senate Republicans have said the same thing. Lisa Murkowski yesterday tweeted that her Christmas wish, her greatest Christmas wish, is to see this done, DACA and the Dreamer issue resolved this calendar year. It is within the power of the Republicans to get this done and to put together a package that we can pass. We want to stand by them, work with them, and get that done.
Nothing focuses the mind like a deadline, though, and using the deadline of the funding as leverage, both for this and also the children's health insurance, 9 million children, that still is yet to be dealt with. You at one point said, I'm not prepared to go home for the holidays until we get our work done. That suggests a little bit of use of this funding as a deadline, but are you really going to go that far?
Well, I feel very strongly about it. There are many important issues. DACA, to me personally, and the DREAM Act are very personal and mean an awful lot. But when we're talking about funding our government, providing the resources and programs that middle income families use across America, dealing with the opioid crisis, making certain that we take care of our veterans, making certain that we have the money for biomedical research. These are part of the conversation and part of the dialogue as we close down this budget. It is up to the Republicans to make a decision about what we will do.
Fine.
I think we can get this done right.
Final question, Senator. You're on the Judiciary Committee. There have been some questions raised about inspectors, people working for the special counsel, one of whom sent disparaging texts about the president, and then another who went to Hillary Clinton's victory party and also praised blocking the president's travel ban. How big of a deal do you think this is, that these questions are being raised?
Let me say at the outset, I have the highest confidence in Bob Mueller. I also have confidence that if he has any questions about the motives or conduct of his staff, he will act on it decisively and professionally. He is moving forward on this investigation. I trust him. If there's something that went wrong in terms of the staffing, I trust him to take care of it.
All right, Senator, that's it. We're out of time. Thanks so much for being with us, and we'll be right back in a moment. Stay with us. Questions are leaving us now, but we've got a lot more Face the Nation coming up. Plenty of analysis on news here and abroad. Stay with us.
This man has one of the most dangerous occupations in the world, running for president against Vladimir Putin.
Why are you still alive?
A courageous candidate tonight.
A star-studded all-new week on Colbert kicks off with Matt Damon Monday and Tuesday, Tommy.
The Mercedes-Benz winter event is back. And you won't want to stop for anything else. Lease the GLA 250 Maddow for $369 a month at your local Mercedes-Benz dealer. Mercedes-Benz, the best or nothing.
I'm a small business, but I have big dreams.
And big plans.
So how can I make the efforts of 8 employees
feel like 50?
How can I share new plans virtually?
How can I download an e-file?
virtual tours,
Zip file.
Really big files.
in seconds, not minutes?
Just like that.
Like everything?
The answer is simple.
I'll do what I've always done.
Dream more?
Dream faster. And above all,
Now?
I'll dream gig.
Now more businesses in more places can afford to dream gig. Comcast, building America's largest gig speed network.
Tom Russell, Steve Knight, Chris Nallen, and Stacey Hanrahan. When severe weather strikes, turn to CBS 21 News, Central PA's most experienced weather team.
Paint with family and friends at Color Me Mine, Harrisburg.
Welcome back to Face the Nation. For a closer look at some of the major issues we're facing abroad, we turn to Kori Schake, who is a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Her new book is Safe Passage, the transition from British to American hegemony. Michael O'Hanlon, a senior fellow and director of research at the Brookings Institution, is here, and he, of course, is in Washington. Kori, let me start with you. I tried to get the UN ambassador to give me a sense of why now on Jerusalem. Why now?
It's not clear why now. I think the White House is hoping that it will push the peace process forward by, as Nikki Haley said, taking Jerusalem off the table. I think that's unlikely to prove true. I think it's going to make that peace process a lot more complicated because it doesn't look like they had anything to offer Palestinians.
Right.
And so it's surprising that other countries in the region care less, in part because they need more cooperation from Israel now than before.
Michael, what's your view? People see this violence. How should they see this? Big deal? Should they be nervous? What's your sense?
Well, I'm glad you asked it that way, John, because I think it's a medium deal. It's not the end of the world. President Trump didn't say that East Jerusalem could never be the capital for Palestine. He didn't make any other such declarations that were really out of what we all expect in any kind of a final peace agreement anyway. And of course, the peace process, even though Corey's totally right that this is not helpful for the peace process, it wasn't exactly going anyplace anyway. So I think there are bigger questions about what kind of leverage can we create with both parties, and perhaps we need to think harder about that. But I don't see this as more than what my colleague Natan Sachs calls an unforced error. In other words, it's not a tragedy. It's probably a mistake. It probably complicates the atmosphere. I'm not sure it really changes the terms of any potential peace deal or really impedes any negotiation that was having any momentum to begin with.
Let's talk now about a place where an unforced error could lead to a tragedy, which is North Korea. Corey, what's happening right now? Americans hear, it's perilous, and then the issue goes away, and then it becomes perilous again. How should people think about this?
Well, I'm more concerned about it now. I think what I hear out of the White House parallels pretty closely what the Bush administration sounded like in 2003 in the run-up to the Iraq War, that the leadership of North Korea is fundamentally erratic and untrustworthy, that retaliation is inadequate as a strategy, and I think they're not thinking through quite carefully enough, for example, what Asia will look like geopolitically if the United States engages in a preventative war that the Australians, Japanese, and South Koreans don't want and might not participate in.
Michael, Corey raises 2003. This president has said that the lead up to the Iraq War and the war itself was the greatest blunder in American history. So parallels to that. That should make people nervous.
And this would probably be 100 times more lethal for Allied forces than the Iraq War. We have to keep that in mind. Let's say the North Koreans can only detonate 1 or 2 nuclear weapons, but they're over Seoul. Then we have up to a couple 100,000 Americans in Seoul. Leave aside the issue of whether the families of American servicemen should come home. There are a lot of American civilians who just live there doing business. So if we were to have a war in Korea, the estimates are that 1 nuclear explosion over that densely populated city could kill about 2 or 3 times as many people as the Hiroshima or Nagasaki bomb. And that's for 1 explosion. So anything that leads us towards a higher probability of nuclear war, I think is probably a huge mistake. But there is, I don't want to be too scary, there is one potential interpretation of what's going on that's a little more hopeful, which is that the Trump administration really doesn't have particular interest at the end of the day in launching a preventive war, but by creating the sense that they are impatient, they're trying to persuade China to turn the economic screws more forcefully and try to get us in a better bargaining position. I'm not comfortable with this situation because I don't know if what I just said is true, and if the alternative interpretation is true, then we could be in for a horrible war, the worst since World War II.
Moreover, the administration is painting themselves into a corner with the rhetoric, even if it is just intended to make the Chinese more cooperative. They are saying that the sand is slipping through the hourglass and we might have to act soon, and the military option is the only option if this doesn't work. And that actually, I think, not only creates a red line, it attaches a ticking clock to it.
If I could add, the question, too, I agree 100% with Corey. The question is, what are the military options under consideration? All-out preventive war is, of course, the extreme. There's also one idea that Ash Carter and Bill Perry, 2 former secretaries of defense of the Democratic Party, wrote about 10 years ago. They're not necessarily articulating it now, but 11 years ago, they suggested that we shoot down a North Korean ICBM launch before it either gets off the launch pad or before it gets out of the atmosphere, and just deny North Korea the ability to really learn more about its missile programs. That's a very dangerous idea, too, because you don't know what North Korea is going to do in response. But that's the sort of idea that may be in play here.
Let me step back here for a second and ask you all both a question about the larger buildup of forces. There is in the Congress a request for even more money than the president has asked for his defense budget. Corey, what do you think will happen with that? And do we need all this money?
I'm skeptical that the Congress is actually going to pass an appropriations bill that will give the Defense Department the $700 billion that authorizers in Congress have asked for. It looks to me much more likely that we will see a series of continuing resolutions. We're already a third of the way into the fiscal year. So I'm really skeptical, both because of the way the president's budget teed this up. So Congress is going to be adding $100 billion over what the president requested. But I'm also skeptical that they can get deals on the other things like DACA, like the spending distinction between domestic and national security. It looks to me like this is likely to drag on, and that's actually terrible for the Defense Department. Continuing resolutions prevent them starting new programs. It prevents the managerial latitude that DoD needs to use the money well. So rather than add more money, I would instead give DoD the latitude to do a lot more programmatic management. I think that would help them a lot more.
Michael, your thought?
Amen. I mean, we're at a point here in December, 2.5 months into the new fiscal year. We don't know if the defense budget is going to be $600 billion for this year or $700 billion. That's a huge gap, and that's roughly the range of play. And Donald Trump is sort of in between in his request. I'm sort of in between myself. The Congress, under Senator McCain and Congressman Thornberry and others, have proposed the $700 billion. Anything north of $600 billion exceeds the Cold War average when you adjust for inflation. I do think we need a bit more money, but I think what we need really is clarity and a decision, because you can't do proper training, maintenance, you can't enter into long-term contracts, you can't just do good custodianship of the Department of Defense when you're this far into the year and you don't know what your budget will be.
All right, that's it for both of you. Thank you so much. And we'll be right back to discuss the political news of the week with our political panel. And we turn now to our political panel. Molly Ball is national political correspondent for Time magazine. Their person of the year was the Silence Breakers and the Me Too movement. Lanhee Chen is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and a policy advisor to the Romney and Rubio presidential campaigns. We're also joined by CBS News White House and senior foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan and Ed O'Keefe, who covers Capitol Hill for the Washington Post and is a CBS News contributor. Margaret, I want to start with you on this question of Jerusalem. What do you make of this decision and the timing of it?
Well, this appears to have been a significant foreign policy and national security decision made primarily for domestic political reasons by the President of the United States. He succeeded in touching probably the most sensitive nerve in one of the most intractable conflicts in history. And this is going to make for a complicated visit for Vice President Pence, who has to head to Israel and to Egypt within just a week or so. But what the President appears to be doing here, it's interesting, with all due respect to the UN ambassador who was talking to you about making this decision. It doesn't do the things she said. It doesn't actually move the embassy. In fact, the president on camera signed a waiver keeping the embassy in Tel Aviv. And it doesn't, for the moment, decide the fate of Jerusalem. If you listen to the president's national security team, who says, actually, we're still up for negotiation on the final status. In fact, if you ask U.S. diplomats where the city of Jerusalem is located, they still won't tell you it's located in Israel. They'll just tell you it's the political capital. So it appears to be the kind of sleight of hand that allows the president to say he achieved a campaign objective, much like the Iran deal, without necessarily changing things, because any new embassy is going to take 4 years or more to build.
All right, let's now move back to domestic issues. Molly, let's go to Alabama here. We got a Senate race going to come to its conclusion next week. Where do you think things stand in this race?
I do not think we know how this is going to turn out. There has seemed to be a shift in the conventional wisdom toward Roy Moore. You hear a lot of predictions that he is going to prevail, because the beginning of the accusations against him is now several weeks in the rearview mirror, and a lot of Alabamians have had a chance to sort of process that. But we have still seen polls that are quite equivocal, especially in such a red state. That's pretty remarkable. And what I have heard from my sources on the ground, and I'll be in Alabama in just a few hours, is that voters are pretty powerfully conflicted. You know, these are voters who generally want to favor the Republican, all other things being equal. But you have to remember that Roy Moore, even among Republicans, is a very polarizing figure. There's a lot of Alabamians who see him as an embarrassment to the state, or just as not the sort of person, particularly considering these charges, that they want representing them. So whether that is enough to put a Democrat over the top in a state like Alabama is very difficult to tell.
Lanhee, let me ask you about the reaction to the RNC's supporting Roy Moore this week, the president supporting Roy Moore. There was some talk about and coverage and Republicans saying, I'm through with the party because they're supporting him. Now, that can get over-torqued in today's media environment, so it's hard to know what the level of real outrage. I mean, obviously, Ben Sass said what he said. Senator Collins was disappointed, too. What's your sense of how big a deal this is outside of Alabama for the Republican Party where it is right now?
I think that it is a developing big deal, if that makes sense. As we go into 2018, this is not the last time we're going to see some version of this movie. In other words, I think you're going to continue to see this conflict between different parts of the Republican Party. And yes, it's played out in Alabama in a really concerning fashion. A guy like Roy Moore, clearly very flawed and very problematic. But you're going to have contested primaries potentially in states like Arizona, maybe even Nevada next year. So this battlefield is just being played out right now. People are just kind of stepping onto this battlefield. So I think to the extent that we're seeing this in Alabama now, what we're seeing is a microcosm of the kinds of battles we're going to see through 2018. And for Republicans like myself, it's very concerning because what you're seeing is a fundamental split and fracture in the party that we've known has existed for some time, but now is being played out in a very public way and being played out in elections that really do matter and have policy consequences for the last 2 years of President Trump's administration, at least for his first term.
Well, and Ed, and it was the policy implications President Trump was arguing for, basically saying, whatever you may believe, I want a Republican in that seat.
It worked for him because remember in the last few weeks of the presidential campaign, he was running around the country saying to Republicans, you may not like me, but I'm going to appoint conservative Supreme Court justices and other conservatives to the court. And it worked. 1 in 5 voters showed up, and the exit polls showed the Supreme Court was their top concern. Moore's making the same exact argument, and that may, in fact, end up working for him. What I find interesting, and what will be very curious to track in the next few weeks, is if he wins, how quickly does that ethics investigation begin? How long does it end up taking? And what do they do if it brings forward information that suggests conduct unbecoming of a senator? Susan Collins seemed to suggest today that would be a difficult, thing to do, to expel him. But the fact that there could be a secretive ethics investigation underway will just hang over the Republican Party on Capitol Hill over the course of most of the year, most likely. And, even talking to a colleague who takes photographs up at the Capitol, he says, I suspect most people are even going to avoid getting in the elevator with him because they just don't want to be associated with him at all.
And those are related to the allegations that he denies in terms of sexual misconduct. He doesn't deny having said that homosexual activity should be illegal. He doesn't deny having said that Muslims shouldn't be allowed to serve in the United States Congress. So there are things that are being set up here that not only highlight the divisions you talked about within the Republican Party, some would say the fight for the soul and the identity, but also position the Democrats here. And that's what was so interesting with the Al Franken resignation to come, was that the Democrats seem to be positioning themselves around that identity of this is what we are not. We are not going to play those cultural
I want to get to the Franken, and as you say, resignation to come. We still don't know what the end date on that is. But Lanhee, I wanted to go back to something you said, because Mitt Romney, who you used to work for, came out and basically took the moral position above all other Republicans, basically, and said there's no reason to support Roy Moore, and it's a stain on the party. Then Steve Bannon came back at him from the... What did you make of that back and forth? Does it have any lasting impact? And is Mitt Romney sort of emerging here as something in the Republican Party? Put a name on it.
Well, he's sort of the sensible conscience of the Republican Party in a lot of ways. I mean, look, the only reason anybody cares about what Steve Bannon has to say is to the extent that people think he's a proxy for the president. To the extent that people think that Steve Bannon's expressing a point of view that the president holds, then it's relevant. Otherwise, he's just a political pundit out there with another opinion. And the question really will be to what extent the president carries through this argument. If there is a Senate campaign to be had in Utah for Governor Romney, for example, to what extent is the president willing to go out there and prosecute some argument against Mitt Romney or try to find somebody to run against him. That's the only way it becomes relevant. Otherwise, it's all just a bunch of blather as far as I'm concerned. Now, it's very concerning blather because obviously what Bannon said was completely beyond the pale, what Bannon said about Governor Romney. But I think Governor Romney is putting out there a point of view that, that needs to be articulated in the Senate and in the Congress beyond the 2018 election cycle.
Just so people aren't confused, Steve Bannon said that Governor Romney docked service in Vietnam because he had a religious exemption. He went over, he was a missionary in France, which is a strange thing to say given that his president, Trump, had many, many deferments from the Vietnam War. Let me, Molly, switch to you here on the question of Al Franken. You wrote about him this week and you said he really didn't want to leave the Senate.
He really didn't seem to. I mean, if you saw the farewell speech that he gave, first of all, it took a lot of pressure to get him to resign. And what you saw was more than half of the Democratic caucus had to come out publicly. It wasn't enough. You know, we knew that there was pressure from behind the scenes on Senator Franken, and he resisted that pressure. And that was why his colleagues were forced to come out publicly, all the way up to the Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer. And then finally, very grudgingly, Franken got up there on the floor of the Senate and said he believed it was ironic that he was resigning given the allegations against President Trump and against Roy Moore. This is a sort of whataboutism argument of the kind that we sometimes hear Trump make, right? Why is it fair that you're persecuting me? Look at what crooked Hillary did. It's the same kind of argument. And not only did he not apologize for his alleged misconduct, he took pains to clarify that he hadn't actually admitted to anything, and he cast doubt on some of his accusers. But he did accede to this pressure. There's a lot of resentment and disagreement in Democratic circles about whether this was the right thing to do. A lot of Democrats talking about where they're setting the standard and whether it's fair. Minnesota Democrats, very sad to lose Franken. The National Party, sad to lose someone who's probably the biggest fundraising draw for Democratic candidates across the country. And now you have a situation where, given that Minnesota was quite close in 2016, whoever the governor appoints to fill this seat is going to have to run again in 2018, and that could possibly be a tough race.
All right, we're going to pause that there. We'll be back in a moment with a little more on Al Franken plus taxes. Stay with us. Senator Durbin said there was no political calculation in the Al Franken decision. Do you buy that?
No, not at all. It was a total political calculation. We know that the week before he resigned, he was already facing pressure from his colleagues who were asked to hold off, and that the morning that the final allegations surfaced, they all got together by email and text and phone calls and said, this is it, we got to do this. The party wants to make, the Democrats want to make a competency and professionalism argument in November, believing that that is the way they can take back the House and the Senate. They got to purge all these guys in order to do that, because you can't sit there and have alleged bad actors in your party if you're trying to suggest that you would run the government better. More broadly, I think viewers deserve to know this. It's no secret for those of us who cover Congress that we have all, in one way or another, been contacted by lawmakers or their aides in recent days, privately asking, what else do you have? Who's next? They are terrified of this storyline, and they know the consequences of it now could lead to much bigger problems for their party, maybe for a piece of legislation they're working on, maybe the chance of the party holding together through the elections. But members in both parties, aides in both parties, very concerned that more is to come. And look, I think it's safe to say more is to come. We don't know who exactly it will be about. It will be carefully reported, but it shows you that they are so scared now because they realize so quickly people are disappearing. And think about it. We saw a guy who served for more than 50 years kicked out. We saw the party's one of the party's top fundraisers kicked out. A social conservative warrior, Trent Franks, had to resign amid a lot of questions about his behavior. And we've never seen this kind of a purge, not since the Civil War.
Margaret, I want to switch to taxes here because this is a big thing that's happening too, and the president wants it signed by Christmas. What have you made of his salesmanship of the tax cut bill relative to health care? Because the tax cut bill, according to both the Quinnipiac poll this week and Gallup, has only 29% support in the country. This is a president whose key skill is as a marketer. But that's not very popular for that legislation.
Well, he's marketing something that seems to be different than what is the product he's selling. And the message from the president, even just on Twitter, his constant focus on the stock market, it appears to be that he sees stocks and corporate profits as a proxy for the success of this bill and ultimately his end goal. Even though on the campaign trail, and when he goes out to sell this, he's talking about the benefit to the middle class and to the working class who help to support him. And it's not clear that these pieces at this point add up to a benefit for those people. At this point, though, to say that this would be a boost to corporations, undoubtedly it would, to take the corporate tax rate from 35 down to 20%. But you're not legislating how a corporation spends those profits, right? You're not necessarily forcing income growth. You're not making that worker take home more pay as a result. You can't possibly force that. You also can't force broader employment. So this gamble of how this will ultimately pay off to the broader economic benefit of the country is something that the president seems to be focusing on, whether you call it trickle-down economics or something else.
Lanhee, what did you make of Senator Rubio, who said Republicans should go back and look at a 1977 speech by President Reagan, or not President, then Governor Reagan, where he said the Republican Party has to worry about having a country club big business image?
Well, yeah, I think there's a point that he's making, right? Now, Senator Rubio and Senator Lee had an amendment to the tax bill that would have made the child tax credit fully refundable, which would have been a huge boon to lower middle class and lower income families. And unfortunately, that was voted down by the Senate. I think that point of view, though, suggests that what we're seeing in the tax bill now to Republicans, this is more of a feature and not a bug, right? That they're actually looking at lowering the corporate tax rate. This has been something Republicans, mainstream Republicans, have talked about now for years, if not decades. And so this is actually a relatively conventional tax bill. The difficulty in selling it, though, is how do you translate a corporate tax cut into what it means for the average middle-class worker? There is a strong argument to be made that this tax bill is going to boost growth, which is going to boost wages, which is going to go into the pockets of middle-class taxpayers. But that's not really the argument you're hearing. You're hearing this is a middle-class tax cut. So there's a little bit of dissonance in the messaging that they're going to have to get straight, but I think that it won't inhibit them from getting this bill through and to the president's desk in a matter of weeks.
Molly, 30 seconds. Do you agree? And also, do Democrats have any opportunity here to take advantage of this tax process?
Well, if you believe the Democrats, they are extremely excited about the political opportunity afforded by this tax bill. It is, as you mentioned, very similar to what happened with health care, where Republicans were sort of between a rock and a hard place. They wanted to keep a campaign promise, particularly to their own base, that Republican primary voters who they told they were going to repeal Obamacare and reform the tax system. But the bill itself was broadly unpopular, and it really is not clear whether what was worse for them politically, passing the bill or not passing the bill, given how disliked it is. And so, but what you do hear from Republicans is they feel they have to do this, A, because they think it's a good idea to cut taxes, and also because their base will be so dispirited if they don't get anything done this first year.
All right, got to end it there. Thanks, Molly. We'll be right back.